Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I am joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, how are you? How was your weekend?
I actually had a great weekend. Spent all day out yesterday playing Magic the Gathering, as my name would suggest. And honestly, it's good to be here on a surprise Monday appearance for both of us, and looking forward to the show.
Yeah, me too. I also had a very good weekend. I went to the birthday party of our beloved and much missed Moya Lothian McLean, and a sign of how good it was, I didn't get out of bed until it was dark the next day. Coming up tonight, we'll hear from disability rights campaigner Anna Landre on Starmer's welfare reforms, or cuts actually. Dozens of local councillors have defected to Reform UK. US airstrikes have killed 53 people in Yemen. And new data shows that buy-to-let landlordism is booming in the UK. Surprise, surprise. Keir Starmer's Labour government is going full Tory, with Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall scheduled to announce what are being briefed as the biggest cuts to disability payments since the austerity government tomorrow. We don't know where exactly these cuts will fall yet, but we do know that Chancellor Rachel Reeves is desperate to find savings after a faltering economy has left her short of cash ahead of next week's spring statement. But that's not how the government is framing it. This was Health Secretary Wes Streeting talking to Trevor Phillips on Sunday.
What we're trying to achieve with welfare reform is to make sure that the welfare system does the two things it needs to do. One is to support people who cannot work, to make sure they've got dignity, independence, quality of life. And secondly, for those who can, to make sure that the welfare system isn't just a safety net, but a springboard back to work. We've now got 1 in 8 young people in this country out of work. 1,000 people every day are signing on to personal independence payments. 1,000 a day. That's over the course of a year, size of the city of Manchester. And we've got to make sure that this system delivers for those who need it most and is sustainable for the long term and provides the right kind of support for the different types of need that exist within that group.
Now, Streeting talked there about people just signing on to personal independence payments, or PIP, as though it's an easy process. It really, really isn't. PIP is an award that's given to people whose condition means they need extra help with mobility or daily living, and it's awarded independently of whether you're in work or your personal financial circumstances. The maximum payment is £184 a week, but to get the benefit, you have to fill out a roughly 50-page form going into pretty extreme detail about how your condition affects intimate parts of your daily life, including your ability to dress, wash, and use the toilet. Now, many people who get PIP need extra support just to complete that monster form. Then you have to face an assessment, and you're subject to reassessment every few years. So it's not easy. But despite those barriers to getting PIP, Streeting isn't wrong about the figures. Before the COVID pandemic, there were around 15,000 new PIP awards every month, so about 500 per day. Since the pandemic, that number has risen to 35,000 each month, or just over 1,000 new awards every day, as Streeting said there. But while the number of people claiming the award has risen, approval rates have actually dropped slightly, with only half of those applying ever receiving the payment. Still, PIP is probably going to be the main target of the government's cuts, with Rachel Reeves reportedly looking to find £5 billion in savings. Now, the government had initially briefed that it would be freezing PIP, meaning that the payments wouldn't be lifted in line with inflation next year, effectively making those who depend on the benefit poorer. That plan seems to have been dropped after backbench Labour MPs, as well as some cabinet members, threatened a rebellion. But it's likely that the government will now focus on eligibility criteria for the award, making it harder to have a claim approved. In that interview with Trevor Phillips, Streeting gave this hint about where he thought the criteria could be tightened.
Are people being signed off too easily these days?
Well, the system is definitely unsustainable if it carries on growing at this rate. And I think...
Well, that's a separate point. I think the question, I understand the point about the spending. I'm asking you, though, if the judgments that are being made about who gets welfare benefits and gets signed off work, whether we're now in a situation where it's too easy to get these benefits.
Well, I think there's sometimes a presumption in favour of the benefit system. I'll give you an actual example. A friend of mine, diagnosed with cancer, uncertain prognosis, was told in the conversation, I can sign you onto the welfare system if you want to stop working. And she said, well, why on earth would I want to stop working? I'm to all intents and purposes, able to carry on. I want to carry on. The presumption on the part of the person having the conversation was the presumption that someone would want to stop working. Similarly...
So you want to stop all of that?
Well, I think there's certainly a question about making sure people have got the right support to stay in work wherever possible. That is, and from a health perspective, going out to work is better for your mental and physical health than being stuck at home.
I mean, I can imagine if I had a cancer diagnosis, touch wood, that doesn't happen, I would probably also want to keep working as long as I could. I mean, I have a really, really great job. But I think a lot of people don't have great jobs and have hard jobs that would mean that they just couldn't. And that sort of annoying piece of anecdata there, I had a friend that this happened to, therefore let's make policy, really just seems unacceptable when you're playing with people's lives and their living conditions. Now, Streeting's framing there really implies that PIP is an out-of-work benefit. It isn't. Around a sixth of people claiming the allowance are also in work. So that's over 500,000 people who are on PIP who are working. I'm joined now by Anna Landre, a disability researcher and herself a wheelchair user. Anna, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Anna, let me start by asking you, look, what effect is cutting PIP or making the criteria even more difficult so that people can't get it in the first place? What effect is that going to have on people with disabilities, both those who are actually working, those who aren't, and also those who would like to work?
PIP is meant to account for the extra cost of being disabled, as you've said, which it actually does not. We know from research that the actual cost of being disabled on average is £1,010 per month, whereas PIP offers people that amount, between that amount and £9,500 per year. So it's not even making up for this gap. And what we're looking at for people who are working or for people looking to get into work are having to cut back on essential services like support workers, those who help you shower and get ready for work, for instance, which is not always covered by other schemes like social care and access to work. We're looking about cutting access to accessible commuting, whether in or out of London, where in London only a third of the underground is accessible, and outside many railways require booking of unstaffed stations and assistance to be able to get a ramp to travel. We're looking at people who now can't pay for the taxi that they need to get to work. And that's not a failure of me or of other disabled people. This is a failure of government and of public services to be accessible in the first place. We're also looking at people who will now not be able to pay for their assistive tech. Say if someone's blind, the screen reader that they use to be able to work on their laptop, or if they have an impairment that affects their hands, that does speech recognition, so they can have a way of writing emails, for instance. I also think it's important to talk about the care component of PIP. This means that carers will go unpaid, pushing them into poverty because that care is still going to have to be given. That's not something that'll disappear. So it won't just affect the disabled people receiving PIP, but for instance, their families, their neighbors, parents, siblings who have been working as their carers and getting this really small compensation for that. Even that is in jeopardy. And it's also really important to point out that many of these services are meant to be covered by the government scheme Access to Work. But at any point, if you look at the news, Access to Work is known for having a waiting list of thousands of people and many weeks. So people who need adjustments to work can apply for Access to Work when their employer feels that they can't cover the cost of those adjustments. For instance, a BSL interpreter for a deaf person. Those can be really expensive services. And without them, someone simply can't do their job. But we're seeing Access to Work, another government service, fail. And I would put to the government the question of, if they're looking to put disabled people into work, why don't they first fix their schemes meant to do that before cutting the benefits of disabled people, many of whom are already working?
When Liz Kendall or when West Streeting are trying to get support for these cuts, they talk about putting in measures that will ease people back into work, that will help people back into work, without going into a lot of detail about how that would work. And as you say, Access to Work schemes just haven't been effective. I also think it was a great point you made about carers not being paid, or other. I've heard about people who, for example, can use part of their PIP payment if they, to have someone come in and clear the paths from their house so that they can actually get out of it, and they have to pay for that, obviously. So this is also a way of just, cutting off money going into the economy. It seems if you're doing it on the basis of economic arguments, it's
Absolutely.
A no-win. So okay,
People
so
often
tell us.
People
Go
often
on, sorry.
forget that benefits like this and welfare in general has one function of being essentially economic stimulus for people who would otherwise be so-called inactive. And I think we can question that label a bit later. But this is a way to keep them within the economy and to put money back into it and encourage that things keep moving.
Okay, so look, tell us what your ideas are for how the government, because look, we have to say, like, the PIP bill is growing and it is huge, and it's expected to grow a lot more in the coming years. So, in your view, what are more effective ways that the government could make work more accessible for people with disabilities? And I want to start from the premise that people actually do want to work a lot of the time.
Absolutely. That was the first thing I was going to say, that it's a false narrative that disabled people are resistant to the idea of work, that disabled people who can work want to sit around their houses all day and do absolutely nothing. And I think the first thing to do is to fully fund access to work program, as we mentioned a bit before. There are stories of people having waiting periods of up to 30 weeks to get the support they need to do their job. And I don't know about you, but if I wasn't able to do my job for 30 weeks, I would lose it pretty quickly. So that's a significant reason why disabled people are not able to go into work. They know how this story is going to end. The services are not there. And the access to work stories that don't make it into the news, unlike the one about the 30-week waiting period, are things like reimbursements being delayed for months, ensuring that people have to pay out of pocket for really expensive equipment and services. There are things like payment approvals being reversed for seemingly no reason, inconsistent rulings on eligibility for certain support, and on and on. So we need to look at that program certainly before anything else. But in addition to access to work, there's a lack of part-time jobs and flexible work jobs that are often best suited to disabled people, especially those with fluctuating conditions. Rachel Charlton-Daly, who's a disabled journalist, pointed out today that out of 27,467 jobs on the DWP Find a Job site, there are only 8 that are fully remote, disability confident, and part-time. And I think that is absolutely unforgivable. You're going to say that disabled people ought to work, and disabled people are going to look at you and say, where are the jobs? Where are the level access commuter trains? Where are the accessible homes I can take a shower in? Where are the employers who will hire me when I sometimes need to lie down due to pain or spasms? Where are the carers who will help me get dressed at 6 a.m.? Oh yeah, we made most of them leave because of Brexit. Where's the reduction in wait times for access to work, for wheelchair services when my wheelchair breaks, for NHS treatment when I need treatment for my really complex disability? We need to look beyond just jobs and what makes an accessible job, like getting into the building, like having an employer that will hire you. We need to look at all the things that allow us to work, like having a home we can live in, like being healthy in an NHS crisis, like having support at home in a social care crisis. We need to look at the fact that even within London, only 3% of homes are even visitable if you use a wheelchair. That doesn't mean livable. That doesn't mean you can use the bathroom or cook in the kitchen. And in fact, compliance with standards of accessible housing are dropping. And in terms of transport as well, I think it's important to note that Labour just went back on the pledge to put accessibility at the heart of rail policy. That was, interestingly enough, a Conservative pledge, and Labour just went back on it. So I think we really need to ask government what they think they are doing when they say disabled people ought to work, but they're making it damn near impossible for us to do so.
Yeah, I think the picture you paint there of a world which is so unfriendly towards people with disabilities that it's constantly kind of shrinking as people kind of ignore the sorts of actually easily implementable things they could do to make work or make homes more accessible is a really huge issue for the government to tackle, which I think you're right, would absolutely help people to actually not just get into work, but live fuller lives as parts of society, doing things that, all of us like to do, visit friends, so on and so forth, get a tube somewhere, visit somewhere. Now, this weekend, I noticed a lot of stuff online all around one way in which people with disabilities are able to access mobility, which is the Motability scheme. So over the weekend, there was this from the Telegraph: want a brand new BMW, either pay £52,000 or tell the DWP about your mental health. A well-intentioned scheme for the genuinely needy has grown to gargantuan proportions. Anna, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this was a really interesting thing to see over the weekend. So for some background, essentially this headline is implying that the Motability scheme, which is a scheme to enable disabled people with mobility disabilities, and this is key, to access a car, given the fact that other transport is often not accessible. Essentially, this article and some conservative pundits are implying that all you have to do is say you have a mental health problem and the government will give you a car, which is not the case. The way Motability works is it's connected to PIP, the payments we were discussing earlier. So essentially, disabled people who qualify for PIP with a mobility component, so you have a significant mobility disability, you can give up the mobility part of your PIP, all of that money, to lease a car from Motability, a company, for a few years, usually 3, sometimes 5, and then it will be taken back from Motability because you never own that car. Motability does, and they want to sell it when it's not too old so they can continue to make a profit, and then they'll do some eligibility checks and give you another leased car, which you are still paying for every month with the entirety of your mobility payment of your PIP. And this works well for a lot of people. It's a good program. What you're not seeing, though, is it's not without its issues. There are long wait times for cars for many people, even longer for maintenance for those who already have cars. I have many friends who their supposedly accessible car has been unusable for months while they wait for repairs from Motability. And likewise, the eligibility criteria for it seems to be shrinking. Those, particularly with more significant disabilities who have carers, are at some points now being told, oh, well, shouldn't your carer just be able to drive you? You don't need to drive, with no attention to whether or not their carer, say, has a license, for instance. And so what you've seen in reaction to this really sensationalized and untruthful story, this bit of clickbait by these pundits, is disabled people saying, oh, would you like my car? Sure, you can have it. Take my Motability car. I'll take your legs. And how about you give yourself a disability and then you can get a car? This sounds like such a good deal.
Anna, stay with me for a moment because I want to come back to you in this next part of the story. A major focus in the briefings on the cuts has been on people claiming PIP and other incapacity benefits for reasons connected to their mental health. So this is from the Institute for Statistics, and the green bars show the growth in PIP awards for different conditions between 2020 and 2024. And as you can see, awards are up for all conditions, but mental health conditions have shown the greatest increase at 7,000 extra claims per month. The second biggest increase has come from those suffering musculoskeletal conditions like arthritis. Now, this graph shows the growth in those claiming PIP for anxiety and depression as a proportion of the working population by age between 2012, the orange bars, and 2023, the grey bars. And as you can see, these conditions are much more prevalent among every age group than they were in 2012. And while young people make far fewer overall PIP claims than older age groups, they've also shown the highest growth in mental health claims. Now, in a different interview, this time with Laura Kunsberg, Wes Streeting was asked about the growth in mental health diagnoses.
Now, in the last few days, it's interesting. The prominent neurologist, Suzanne O'Sullivan, has said there's overdiagnosis of mental health problems. Your colleague, Liz Kendall, when she was here, talked about the problems of self-diagnosis when people feel that they might have a condition. Do you believe, as the Health Secretary, that too many people are being treated as sick and incapable of work for essentially struggling with what are quite normal feelings?
Well, I want to follow the evidence, and I agree with that point about overdiagnosis. But here's the other thing. I mean, mental well-being, illness, it's a spectrum, right? And
but you do think
I think
there's
too many.
overdiagnosis?
I think there's an overdiagnosis, but also there are too many people being written off. And to your point about treatment, there's too many people who just aren't getting the support they need. So if you can get that support to people much earlier, then you can help people to either stay in work or to get back to work.
Didn't know that Wes Streeting was doing a medical degree. In all those years, he was on the back benches, and on the shadow benches, rather. And it's important to point out that many people claiming PIP or incapacity benefits will have multiple conditions, with mental health difficulties often accompanying physical conditions. But what do you make of something that seems clearly true, that more people than ever are applying for PIP and getting it on mental health grounds? And also Streeting's more questionable claim that these conditions are overdiagnosed.
I think it's a really good question, and probably is one of the biggest policy questions that we're going to see in these years. But I think we can't look at changes in the benefit system and trends in who's claiming and where they're claiming in isolation from other societal changes. For instance, we currently have the largest ever NHS backlog for treatment. So let's think about that. Those who have mental health difficulties, whether they be very severe or very minor, are not getting treatment for them. So they're only getting intensified and far worse than they have to be or were originally. Now think about those with physical health issues who also can't get treatment because of this backlog and who are then developing mental health issues. I think we even saw Wes Streeting in that clip mention the inability of people to get the treatment that they need. And I think that's probably a big driver of this, and something that government should absolutely be addressing because it's unconscionable. We shouldn't have a country in which this many people are suffering mentally or physically in ways that are avoidable. And I also think you'll find that it isn't just that mental health applications for PIP are increasing. It's that more people with, say, mobility impairments or sensory impairments, say being blind or deaf or some other impairment, are also applying for the mental health component of PIP, in addition to the other, perhaps we'll say primary disability, where they were applying for a mobility component or a sensory component. And we don't have an evidence base for why this might be, but there are some reasons I can perhaps think of, and hopefully we'll have more research on in the future. One is that there's increasing awareness of what mental health is, that it matters, what bad mental health or good mental health looks like. Two, increasing societal integration for disabled people also means increasing experiences of ableism. When you're able to be out in society, going out with your friends, going to a restaurant, you're going to find that half the time the restaurant has steps, or maybe you'll be asked a really rude question or harassed or denied your guide dog accessing that restaurant. And this is leading to a lot of disabled people saying, wow, life is really difficult and having those mental health effects. Likewise, the political rhetoric towards disabled people over the last few years is leading to mental health struggles for a lot of people. I heard Mick Scarlett, who's a disabled activist, say recently that it used to be that when disabled people were talked about as getting benefits, when he would mention that he gets benefits, he's a wheelchair user, people would say, that's good. I'm glad my tax dollars are paying for that. Life is harder for you. Life is more expensive for you, and you need it. And now he's greeted with suspicion, with hostility, as a scrounger. So there's this very different, perhaps, experience of being a person with a disability in this benefit system. And it's interesting to think about the system as perhaps responsible for the unsustainability of itself. And I think we have to look at that. And I've also heard over the past few weeks about several people with mobility disabilities who actually use their PIP to pay for mental health for therapy due to the mental health effects of their disability and living difficult lives, constantly meeting up with barriers and not being able to get that mental health support through the NHS. So I think this growth in mental health claims is real, but just more generally, think of the daily mental health challenges that both people who already have disabilities, whether they be mobility or otherwise, but people in general are facing. Moving every year due to rent increases, lives destabilized during the pandemic in ways that never went back to normal, social media creating a culture of comparison, perfectionism. It's really no wonder that the lifestyle that many people are forced to live is resulting in a society with increased mental health problems.
Yeah, I think something that's so striking for me about the way that the government is positioning this is that they say, look, people in receipt of PIP, it's going up. But it's also the case that the assessments are returning the same proportion as being, of claims as being legitimate PIP claimants, and then noticing the large rise in mental health. And instead of thinking, oh, actually, what we're seeing here is like an epidemic, where our experts are saying, yes, loads more people are applying for PIP on mental health grounds or on mixed mental health and physical grounds. And they're getting it. And rather than thinking, oh, there's some like really big public health moment that's happening here, they're just like, oh, it's just too easy. It's just, they've just got to go back to work. That's the problem. And as you say, casting people under a cloud of suspicion when actually all of their own data suggests, no, we're facing a real social health phenomenon here.
Yeah, I think it's one of the greatest questions of, I don't know whether to say a decade, a generation. I suppose we'll see. But I also think if we're talking about mental health, cuts to disability benefits and services cannot be seen in isolation also from the push for assisted suicide, with an unprecedented lack of safeguards in the assisted suicide bill that we're seeing go through Parliament. And that's unprecedented even compared to countries like Canada, that have since expanded their eligibility from just the terminally ill to people who are homeless, who have anorexia, who in one case are a Paralympian who requested a wheelchair ramp on her house. And now you're seeing hundreds of claims, hundreds of investigations of claims that perhaps the assisted suicide was delivered in a way that was horribly unethical. And Tanni Grey-Thompson said just a few days ago that disabled people will feel forced to end their lives in this country if it continues to be so difficult, if these cuts make things untenable for many. And we're poised to see perhaps a system where a state-assisted suicide service is easier to access than assisted living services for those with severe disabilities. And without the option for a dignified life, disabled people may choose death. And that's not something that any of us want.
No, it's a very, as you say, it's a very dangerous turn. And I tell you what wouldn't lead people to ending their lives is a wealth tax, which would raise more than enough of the money that's being chased here by Rachel Reeves and cuts. Look, I've got one last clip for you, Anna. This was West Streeting talking about what actually might be a productive reform to our disability benefit system.
I think the other thing I'd say is about the jeopardy and the poverty trap. So today, one of the things that Liz is floating is that she'll be putting forward the right to try. So there are lots of people who are in the welfare system on benefits. They'd like to go back to work. There might be a job opportunity that becomes available. But in order to take it up, when they take it up, they immediately lose all of their benefits. And if for whatever reason the job doesn't fall through or the employer says, actually, this isn't working out, off you pop, they're not back to the benefits they had before. They're right back to square one of having to apply again, all of that anxiety, the gap between incomes, of the distance between losing your job and getting the income support that you need. And so what Liz is creating is a right to try, where you have that security of knowing you take on a job. If it doesn't work out, you don't go back to square one. You go back to the support you had before, and then you can give something else a try.
In that interview with Trevor Phillips, Streeting gave this hint about where he thought the criteria could be tightened.
This is really key, and it's something I'm really happy to see in terms of disability policy, and perhaps one of the few actually substantive positive changes that we've seen from this government. I worked for years on the US benefit system with respect to disability, to very little avail, but there is a severe problem there that we call, or at least I call, the disability poverty trap, where being in the system creates such disincentives to work that the employment rate for disabled people in the US is very, very low. And that's not something we want there, here, in any country. And I do think it's interesting because in societies built on a capitalist system, as all of us are, that defines disability very often as an inability to produce economic value. It is then very cruelly ironic and hypocritical when the system turns around and then punishes disabled people for fulfilling that prophecy, for actually being the people who struggle to produce economic value as defined by the system. And so it becomes this catch-22. Either you're disabled and you can't work, in which case you need welfare to survive and are an undeserving scrounger, useless mouth, or you're a disabled person who can work, in which case you must need no assistance at all, even though the world continues to be harder for you than it is for everyone else. And this is a dichotomy that doesn't reflect reality. It never has. But it's a dichotomy that remains in the minds of many, in the members of the public and those who make policy. So I think this is a really good reform that gets at the fact that that dichotomy isn't true, that we need varying levels of support, that we need the option to come on and off support as is needed, because often this process, like many people's disabilities, are not linear.
Yeah, so, okay, buried under all those layers of cruelty, Liz Kendall maybe got one thing right, and we should give her some credit for that. Anna Landre, thank you so much for joining us. You've been a great guest. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's have a look at the politics around these proposed cuts. So I've already mentioned that a potential revolt of backbench Labour MPs appears to have crushed the idea of freezing PIP next year, although we will find out for sure only when Kendall announces her package. But for many Labour MPs and Labour supporters, trying to extract £5 billion from some of the country's worst off is not a very Labour look. This was Diane Abbott on Radio 4's Today programme.
Do you have any time for the argument that actually being on welfare is what traps people in poverty?
I think being on welfare is very depressing. It's very humiliating. It sort of brings you down. But I have no sympathy with the idea that the way to get people out of welfare is to cut the money they have to live on. I have no sympathy with the idea that it's a lifestyle choice.
What about the national economic picture? The fact is we've got a very sharply rising welfare bill. We've went through some of the statistics earlier at a time when money for public finances is tight. So what would you do to get that bill down?
I would introduce a wealth tax. If you brought in a wealth tax of just 2% on people with assets over £10 million, that would raise £24 billion a year. That's what I would do.
Don't you think that might have other undesirable economic effects?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me 2% on an income of £10 million, that shouldn't have some massive effect. I don't think so, no.
On Good Morning Britain, Richard Madeley asked Treasury Minister Emma Reynolds about other Labour MPs struggling to reconcile themselves with these cuts.
I'll quote you two newspapers this morning. The Guardian, they have a Labour MP, unnamed, saying that the party and the backbenchers are approaching the days ahead with, quote, absolute horror. You have another Labour MP telling the I newspaper that, quote, I've heard a lot of colleagues saying that this feels like a Tory approach and not a Labour policy. So let me pick up on that point. Did people who voted Labour a few months ago, have they ended up with a Tory government?
We are not a Tory government. We are a Labour government. And as Liz Kendall has said, there is a Labour case here for reform because we believe in the dignity of work. And we believe that there are far too many people who are being failed by the current system. We inherited this mess from the Tories. There was no plan from them to reform it in any significant or meaningful way. And as I've said, the current system is too binary.
What do you say to people who say that the Labour Party in the last couple of months has effectively stolen the Conservatives' clothes, and not to mention summer reforms underwear as well?
Well, I'd say that's complete rubbish.
Is it complete rubbish, though? In the last months of his premiership, Tory Prime Minister Rishi Sunak launched a review of PIP, with campaigners accusing him of a full-on assault on disabled people. Sunak's Work and Pensions Minister, Mel Stride, also proposed cutting PIP for those with depression or anxiety, describing them as milder mental health issues. He also said that you could get thousands a month from PIP, which is just bollocks. And just last week in Parliament, Health Secretary Wes Streeting basically made Richard Madeley's case for him.
I appreciate it must be so painful for the Conservative Party. It must be so painful watching a Labour government doing the things that they only ever talked about, reducing the size of bloated state bureaucracy, investing in defence, reforming our public services, bringing down the welfare bill. The public are asking, what is the point of the Conservative Party? I bet they're glad they chose change with Labour.
The public might be asking, what's the point of the Conservative Party? But if they're asking that because Labour is now doing conservatism better than the Tories did, you might as well ask, what's the point of the Labour Party? Helena, what is the point of the Labour Party?
I mean, in its current form, it doesn't seem like it has any purpose whatsoever apart from bashing the left, really. I mean, this is why they have essentially stolen the Conservatives' clothes for a huge raft of their policies, right? I mean, there's a reason for this kind of right-wing nature of the Labour Party. Some of it is ideological, some of it is due to electoral reasons, right? Ideologically, there are some people at the top of the Labour Party who are just quite right-wing, you know? And especially people who have their hands on the levers of power, people like Morgan McSweeney and Pat McFadden and Rachel Reeves. Very funny that she was like, what, on political thinking, almost in tears at the suggestion that she was a red Tory. Yet she is the one with the fiscally austere approach that's being pushed here, along with 4% Liz Kendall, who couldn't get any support in a pretty, progressive voter base for the Labour Party in 2015. Yet here she is getting shuffled into a position she has zero aptitude for just because she's mates with the right people from Labour together. It's also very funny to hear people talking about, we're the Labour Party, therefore we believe in the dignity of work, going like full Protestant work ethic. Also really funny to hear the, quote, dignity of work argument coming from a bunch of people, both in politicians who've essentially, a load of these people have had their careers in like lobbying or being people who've been in people's offices and political staffers whose job insists of typing up some stuff in a Word document on their MacBook twice a week. And I suppose ever these people really think that there's much dignity, I don't know, in, urinating in bottles for Amazon or wearing an electronic tag in a warehouse, for example, which is the reality of work for loads of people in this country, So I don't get these arguments a lot of the time, because the reality is that Labour should be the party of working people themselves. It should be the party of workers, not of work ethic in its sense, right? This idea that work itself is a uniquely edifying thing to engage in as of itself, rather than towards creating a social contract, right? This kind of idea of a social contract has been abandoned by 45 years of neoliberal economic policy, and that has been internalised by basically all of our political class, both Labour and Tory, and of course Reform alike as well. Now, there isn't an electoral bind that Labour have caught themselves in. They're talking about this idea of creating blue Labour, essentially saying, well, we're going to be, trying to appeal to more conservative elements because we want to make sure that we capture enough of the swing electorate, the kind of middle class swing electorate, who maybe in their minds think that the fiscally austere approach is reasonable, or the public finances are in a mess. 2010 George Osborne arguments, we have to do these things because we have no choice, which of course we understand isn't true. And I also don't think really has much of an electoral base left anymore. You're seeing people who support Reform UK, who are open Reform UK supporters, who were getting mad about the idea of cuts to the winter fuel allowance or to the cuts to disability, and even Nigel Farage himself coming out against the two-child benefit cap, and Suella Braverman as well. There's no real electoral base in my mind for this incredibly fiscally austere approach, and people want to see actual change and hope and some kind of premise on what they're going to do moving forward, rather than just continuing the same 15 years of conservative approach that Wes Streeting seems to think is somehow this emblematic of the idea of what good governance is, even though that seems to have a very small amount of people actually want to do that. In terms of what's the point of Labour moving forward, well, if the Labour Party aren't going to be the Labour Party and fight for actual Labour values rather than the Protestant work ethic, there has to be an alternative, I'm a member of the Green Party. The Greens are proposing a lot of progressive economic policy that was similar to what Labour were talking about from 2015 until 2019. And of course, there was a good Novara FM episode which was talking about the idea of moving to the Greens, or alternatively, another left-wing party or a left-wing movement within the country which would maintain elements of the kind of momentum style politics from that period from 2015 till 2019 as well. So unless alternatives step up, if the Greens step up the game or a new party emerges, people are going to continue to be stuck with a Labour Party that does not represent Labour values and very little actual representation for that in government.
Yeah, it's always really hard, I think, in the absence of either, as you say, like a Green party stepping up or a new left-wing party. It's very hard to sort of get people's political energy, which is moving away from Labour, anywhere else except to a party on the right. And, I can see why in some cases Reform does look like a more exciting, rebellious, energetic kind of party. But of course, we want something where we can say, okay, take that energy and move it here instead. After 10 days of intense and very public Reform Party infighting over the suspension of Great Yarmouth MP Rupert Lowe, Nigel Farage made the following announcement.
One of the things that we lack in Reform is experience. A lot of our people that have become part of the 400 branches that we've set up that Zia mentioned, a lot of them have never been in politics before. We need some old lags. We need some people who've been in council and know what they're doing. And that's why today I'm delighted to announce that over the course of the last 2 weeks, we have managed to sign up the following people. Reg Kane is a Liberal Democrat on Cheshire East Council and joins us from, wait for it, the Liberal Democrats. Bill Barrett is a former cabinet member who quit the Conservatives over the council's lack of transparency in Ashford, went to the Independents and now joins us here today. Mandy Clare is an ex-Labour councillor who left to campaign against transgender ideology, eroding women's rights, and she joins us on Cheshire West and Chester Council, and is very welcome. Edward Kirk joins us from Wiltshire Council and comes to us from the Conservatives, and he stood as the Conservative leader at the last election. Stephen Atkinson is, until right now, the leader of Ribble Valley District Council for the Conservatives, but I think he might be about to lose his job. And last, and by no means least, is Julian Kirk, elected as a Conservative county councillor. I just love what Julian's done. He's resigned his seat on Norfolk County Council in protest at the elections being cancelled, and will stand as a Reform candidate in those county councils in Norfolk. Thank you.
13 of those new Reform councillors have defected from the Conservatives. 14 were previously independents. And as you saw there, one was previously a Lib Dem. Make it make sense. Another is a former Labour councillor who quit over trans inclusion. Farage also addressed the recent controversy over Rupert Lowe.
Now, you might have noticed that we have been through a little bit of turbulence over the course of the last couple of weeks. We've been increasingly concerned about the behaviour of one of our members of Parliament. And when we found out that some serious complaints had gone in, we thought, you know what, let's just suspend the whip and let's find out what the truth is. And we will wait. First, we will get the report from the Independent King's Council, who's been appointed. I don't know exactly when that's going to be, but some anticipation that it might happen during the course of this week. And later on, perhaps it'll take some time, we'll hear from the relevant parliamentary committee too. Has it caused some consternation? Of course it has. Any argument that seemed to happen within the family does. But I can promise you that in terms of our progress and our planning, that upset is very much at the edges. Today, I'm going to show you the extent to which we are broadening and deepening the party across the country. And there's one thing that today will show you is that the last 2 weeks, we've not been obsessing about what's being written in the papers or being said online. We've been getting on with the job. But I do want to say one thing. Some of the online abuse and frankly outright over racism that has been showed against a senior member of this party, had it been shown towards any other member of the ethnic minorities, from the Labour and Conservative parties, every one of you in the journalistic arena in this room would have been in total and absolute uproar.
Now, it's kind of interesting because accusing liberal and left-wing opponents of racism or hypocrisy over racism is something the right has done more and more in recent years. But the racism Farage accuses journalists of ignoring is from his own party members and supporters. Unsurprisingly, some of those members are now accusing him of, quote, playing the race cards. Now, these announcements are coming ahead of the May local elections. Helena, look, was it on your 2025 bingo card, Nigel Farage lecturing his members and supporters over online racist comments?
I actually thought this was more likely that as time has gone on. So one thing to understand about Nigel Farage is the narrative that he was trying to push. He was pushing this during the election as well. I was paying very, very close attention to him throughout the speeches that he was doing, the talks he was doing, his time at the Reform UK's conference and things like that. One of the things he tries to push very frequently is this idea that he stopped the far right. That's his thing that he keeps talking about. When he was at UKIP, right, he was taking people out of the British National Party and saying to these people, you know, in his own words, right, don't be racist. You know, I understand you have concerns about immigration, but you should be doing this within an electoral movement, for example, that is explicitly and like not racist in his terms, but doing it for economic reasons, right? That's been the line he's trying to push, is that he took people out of that sphere and put them into a mainstream like anti-immigration party because he feels, and maybe the data does suggest that this is true, that there is a large cohort of people in this country who just want to see immigration come down for what they believe are economic reasons or potentially some racist reasons mixed in overall. But they're this sector of the electorate that needs representation in a mainstream fashion, right? That's the narrative that he tries to talk about in terms of which of voters that he is servicing, just regular people who have concerns about immigration, and they have seen Conservative government after Conservative government after Conservative government come into government on a promise of reducing migration, and to see that promise being completely abandoned. And of course, the opposite being true, and that they've let in more migrants, for example, like the Boris wave. People talk about the idea that Boris Johnson let in loads of new migrants because there was almost 1 million in 1 year. Now, that was because of a COVID backlog. There's something there. But he also did increase the number of student visas too, which is a big, big, big section of the newest arrivals in terms of migration, is people coming for student visas, which is good because that's an export good we're selling. They're funding our universities. But that's by the by. And so having an element in his party like Rupert Lowe, for example, and having people within voter base who think that the party can't be trusted because they have an ethnic minority at the top, that breaks that narrative. You know, that breaks that narrative open. He can't say that anymore if he is courting those same people who will reject somebody as being the chair of the party just for they're from an ethnic minority background, right? And whether or not you think that he appointed Zia Yusuf deliberately or not to a position as an ethnic minority to try and use him as a way of pointing out the party is ethnically or religiously diverse and isn't just a party for racist white people. That doesn't really matter as far as the truth of that. I don't think he has personally, but it's certainly a narrative that someone might be able to talk about. That gets undermined if a bunch of reform voters are talking shit about him because he's a Muslim. So it's well within his own remit and his own interest to explicitly call that out, to try and, as I mentioned on the show last week, appeal to a more mainstream moderate voter base who just have the quote unquote immigration concerns, So I think that's very much something that was going to be happening if he wanted to be electorally successful. Because you've got to remember, like, Nigel Farage is in this for economic reasons, He supported Brexit for economic reasons. He supported all of his Thatcherite policies. He praised the Liz Truss budget for being a properly conservative one. All of their posturing about being different than the current con socialists, as Richard Tice calls them, that's all bluster. In reality, they support the same failed economic paradigm that's failed this country for the last 45 years at this point. But he has to be able to talk about other concerns such as that to be able to push through his economic interests and Trojan horse it into government, because that is what he is there for. And that's the problem, is that a lot of the people who are joining Reform UK, they actually don't support neoliberal economics at all. A lot of the people who support Reform UK, I've seen people who are talking about disability, who really do genuinely think it's awful that we be doing all these cuts. They want to see things like rail, mail, energy, water, and public ownership, like we do here on the left. But there's obviously no vehicle mainstream enough for them to get their teeth into. But they do have concerns about migration. And a lot of them, they're just culture warriors. I saw a Politics Joe video interviewing people at the Reform UK conference. And a lot of these people were just talking about, oh, you can't say X, Y, Z anymore. Or they're talking about the history of this country, or the history of colonialism or national pride or whatever. And I'm just like, you look at the actual data on who voted Reform at the last election, it's predominantly a lot of people who are a lot older and people who are a lot wealthier who voted for Reform UK, you know? That is the demographic of people overall, especially the members of the party. So trying to appeal to these people on economic grounds isn't going to work. So he has to find another method. And if he wants to be electorally successful, he has to push the narrative that I talked about at the start. Otherwise, he will lose a lot of his supporters.
Yeah, I suppose he's got a kind of fine line to tread at the moment, though, because until he's got to keep the supporters he's currently got as well, especially going into those local elections in May, right? He doesn't want to, by criticising his current supporters too much, lose a big bunch of those without being sure that he's going to be able to replace them with newer supporters who don't have those attitudes come May. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there and how much, whether this kind of criticism comes up again or whether it's a one-off from him.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to note as well, I was seeing a stat earlier today that 71% of Reform UK voters don't know who Rupert Lowe is. So a lot of this kind of stuff, again, Rupert Lowe gets loads of retweets, he gets loads of traction on social media. A lot of that's a really small bubble of incredibly invested people. And the people who Reform UK is explicitly appealing to are the politically disenfranchised. And they're not paying attention to Westminster squabbles. They're not paying attention to internal party politics. They're people who've been disenfranchised by 45 years of deindustrialisation and stripping back of the public realm in the interest of megacorporations. And they have nowhere else that they feel that they can turn, right? It's about selling a narrative, and that's what's been sold to them, and they're not going to be caring about what happens with regards to what a KC says about internal factional politics of Reform UK. I really don't think so.
The US has launched dozens of air raids in Yemen, killing at least 53 people and injuring 98 more, including many women and children. Targets have included multiple residential buildings and a power plant, as well as Houthi, also known as Ansar Allah, military sites. Here you can see the aftermath of a strike on a residential area in Sada, a northern government of Yemen under Ansar Allah or Houthi control. And here is one of the child victims arriving at a local hospital. The strike is reported to have killed 10 people, injured 13 more, including 2 children, with a further 2 children still missing under the rubble. God. The attacks came after the Houthis threatened to resume attacks on Israeli ships in the Red Sea in response to the total blockade of Gaza, which is now in its 3rd week. The Houthis responded by firing 18 ballistic and cruise missiles at an American aircraft carrier, the USS Truman. Previously, the Houthis did follow through on their promise to halt attacks once a ceasefire was implemented in Gaza. And initially, they only threatened to resume attacks on Israeli ships. In response to US airstrikes, Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi announced that all US military and commercial vehicles would be included in the blockade. Basically, the US has made its ships a target and killed dozens of Yemeni people, all to defend Israel's right to starve the population of Gaza. However, in a post on his social network Truth Social, Trump said he was blaming Iran. He said this: "Let nobody be fooled. The hundreds of attacks being made by Houthi, the sinister mobsters and thugs based in Yemen who are hated by the Yemeni people, all emanate from and are created by Iran. Any further attack of retaliation by the Houthis will be met with great force, and there is no guarantee that the force will stop there. Iran has played the innocent victim of rogue terrorists from which they've lost control, but they haven't lost control. They're dictating every move, giving them the weapons, supplying them with money and highly sophisticated military equipment, and even so-called intelligence. Every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being a shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran, and Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences, and those consequences will be dire." But the links between Iran and the Houthis are well known, so they're not shy about claiming membership of the Axis of Resistance against Israel. And the Houthis have always been clear that their actions are in response to Israel's genocide in Gaza. And make no mistake, that genocide is ongoing. The total blockade, under which no food, water, fuel, or medical supplies have been allowed to enter, is having devastating effects. Here's a report from Al Jazeera.
For months, the people of Gaza have lived under siege, enduring cold, hunger, and constant bombing. With border crossings sealed, the flow of food has slowed to a trickle. The markets are running out of the products, and much of what little is available is now unaffordable. Community kitchens, once feeding thousands, are now fighting their own battle, one against time, scarcity, and worsening starvation. This place was once a lifeline with food, poured in to feed the displaced. Now it's a graveyard of empty shelves and silence rooms.
Community kitchens have been a lifeline for countless displaced families in Gaza, offering the only meal many receive in a day. But with border crossings sealed, the humanitarian situation has worsened dramatically. There is no food, no gas, no wood, nothing left to keep these kitchens running, as hunger tightens its grip on Gaza.
The hunger is no longer creeping, it's consuming, affecting the young, the old, all those displaced.
I used to rely on this simple community kitchen for food, but now even they are struggling to feed us. My children are crying at home from hunger, and I have nothing to give them. I can't afford to buy what we need. There's simply no way to survive.
UNICEF has said that the blockade has left 1 million children in Gaza without the basics they need to survive. And a full half of the population of Gaza are, of course, children. Here's part of a statement from UNICEF Middle East and North African Regional Director Edouard Baigbeder. Without aid entering the Gaza Strip, roughly 1 million children are living without the very basics they need to survive, yet again. Stalled just a few dozen kilometers outside the Gaza Strip sit more than 180,000 doses of essential childhood routine vaccines, enough to fully vaccinate and protect 60,000 children under 2 years of age, as well as 20 life-saving ventilators for neonatal intensive care units. While UNICEF managed to deliver 30 CPAP respiratory machines, which significantly aid newborns experiencing acute respiratory distress syndrome and prematurity, the ventilators are essential for infants needing advanced respiratory support. Tragically, approximately 4,000 newborns are currently unable to access essential life-saving care due to the major impact on medical facilities in the Gaza Strip. Every day without these ventilators, lives are lost, especially among vulnerable premature newborns in the northern Gaza Strip. What's more, Israel has continued bombing targets in Gaza throughout the ostensible ceasefire. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, 150 Palestinians have been killed by the IDF since the ceasefire came into effect in January, including 4 in the last 2 weeks. This quote from a recent Guardian article is a good example of how surreal much of the reporting on this has been. It says, currently, both sides have refrained from returning to war, though Israel has conducted an intensifying series of airstrikes in Gaza that have killed dozens of Palestinians. Just doesn't really mean anything, does it? Both sides are not at war, but one side is bombing the other side to smithereens. As we've also seen in Lebanon, the Israeli definition of a ceasefire often seems to be that their opponents cease and they fire. While they inevitably claim that targets are all militants, this is regularly contradicted by eyewitness accounts and biographical details of victims. For example, multiple witnesses told Al Jazeera that 3 men killed today in an Israeli drone strike in central Gaza had been collecting firewood, while Israel alleges there were fighters planting roadside bombs. I saw Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary, saying, "We've never been closer to peace than we are now." And yet, at the same time, you have Israel bombarding Gaza despite a ceasefire, also blockading it, triggering a further blockade of ships by the Houthis, who have now attacked a US ship, with Donald Trump now threatening Iran with retaliations for that attack from Yemen. Does it feel to you like we're closer to peace than we ever have been?
This is yet another Fell For It Again award to be awarded to all of the MAGA supporters who kept telling us that Trump was a dove. He was the peace president. He doesn't start wars. And yet, of course, and also they told us he was going to be America first, right? It was going to be the American interests of American people that would come first. Yet it clearly, just as it's shown in terms of who he looks to clamp down with essentially state-sponsored SS black-bagging people off the street, there's good critics of Israel that he's going after. And when it comes to his foreign policy, he is literally using American military might in support of Israel. It seems like it's not America first anymore, it's clearly Israel first when it comes to Trump's internal and foreign policies as well. And again, this is American military might being used to defend Israel against people who say that they are engaging in attacks on people, to essentially try and force Israel's hand to stop its illegal blockade of aid into the Gaza Strip, which is a violation of the provisional measures set out by the ICJ over the claims in the court with regards to Israel inflicting genocide on the Palestinians. And what's going to happen if this continues? We will continue to see what has happened every single time the United States and Western allies have tried to be belligerent and trying to engage in interventionism in the Middle East. It will just create more power vacuums. It will create more displacement, and it will create more war and more refugees, right? He is not, of course, not a peace president. He never has been a peace president. This was the same guy who assassinated Qasem Soleimani in his first term, and he is continuing his belligerent actions against what he perceives to be Iranian threats continually. And again, this is served in support of their colonial outpost in the Middle East, Israel itself, as well. We will continue to see destabilization and blowback if this continues, and I am, of course, sure that it will, because Trump has been very clear that he backs Israel to the hilt in continuing engaging its military actions in the Gaza Strip. And, of course, what people seem to, outside of us here in Novara Media, keep continually forgetting about, which is the continual incursions of the IDF into the West Bank, which Netanyahu has been open and clear that he wants to annex as much of as possible with Trump's blessing. You know, didn't Netanyahu say that Trump was a gift to Israel himself in the Knesset? This is the future of Israel's approach to what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank with absolute impunity, because there is no one who can hold him accountable when the power of the United States is behind him.
Yeah, he also described him as Israel's greatest friend ever. So yes, I agree. I think we're just going to see this get worse. I mean, I guess one hopeful thought is that with global tariffs and a shifting foreign policy situation in respect of US allies, some of them might go where the wind is blowing in another direction and change their foreign policy towards Israel as a result. Let's see how that develops. Today, the OECD made a gloomy prediction about the UK's future economic prosperity. The economic organisation slashed the UK's projected economic growth for this year to 1.4%, down from 1.7%, with even worse growth expected in 2026. Hooray. Now, Donald Trump's tariffs on trade are taking a lot of the blame for this grim assessment, but new data from Companies House shows that an emerging economic reality more close to home may also be adding to the country's lack of productivity. The data shows that buy-to-let businesses are now the most common type of company in the UK. Apparently, there are nearly 4 times as many companies set up to hold buy-to-let property than there are takeaways or hairdressers. It's crazy. To be precise, as of February, there are 401,744 buy-to-let landlords registered with Companies House, up from 92,975 in February 2016. Bonkers. Estate agent Hampton says that's because of tax changes and increased mortgage costs, forcing smaller landlords who hold properties in personal ownership and declare income in their annual tax self-assessment to sell up. And actually, that is something that is happening with my own landlord right now, who's likely to sell up in the coming months, meaning I have to find somewhere new to live, along with many, many, many other people. Other private landlords are simply creating holding companies, moving their properties from their personal ownership to a company in order to avoid tax changes. From the perspective of renters, it's not yet clear what the impact will be. I mean, some of the worst horror stories I've heard have involved small landlords refusing to do basic repairs or insisting on bodging it themselves, letting themselves in with no warning, and doing other flagrantly illegal things. At the less serious end of the spectrum, the internet is full of examples of landlords painting over, well, basically anything. I think my favorite is probably this. Yes, that is in fact several wasps' nests that have been given a fresh coat of magnolia emulsion. Of course, companies are not necessarily any better. And of course, if they're operating a large volume of rentals, they can push prices up more quickly by slanting the market. The issues might sometimes be different, but in my experience, it's very much a pick your poison sort of a situation, whether it's between a private landlord or a company. But with the increase in companies, the wider point is that it's becoming increasingly difficult for the government to claim that the benefit of landlordism is that it allows individual people to invest for retirement. If private companies are being set up or are sweeping up the increased sale in houses and flats rather than, people who actually need a home, wealth inequality is only going to grow. And of course, private landlords who are setting up these companies are also finding ways of avoiding the tax that they would otherwise have to pay. And that altogether is, as we know, an extremely damaging development for the economy, especially the idea that the housing just gets frozen out of the market. I mean, what's the point of working if the dream of owning a house is pushed even further away and half your monthly income or more is now not going into the pocket of your landlord who would then have to pay tax on it, but into the pockets of a business? Helena, look, if you had to choose, would you prefer your landlord to be a company or some guy?
I mean, in my own personal experience, right, this is entirely anecdotal. I've had much better experiences with renting from a big company than I have from a small-time landlord. And I think my diagnosis for why I've had that personal experience is that most of the big companies, they just want to be able to get your rent at the end of it and not have to deal with any hassle, because it's people working, doing jobs who are administrating this, rather than someone with a direct investment in the value of the property. Whereas when I've had small-time landlords just fighting endlessly to try and get deposits back, having repairs done, that's been an endless nightmare, because it's a lot of these people, it is their retirement savings, it's their little nest egg, or even worse, it is the trust fund for their kids to be able to also not have a job like the landlord doesn't have a job. And I think that's been my experience. But I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who have much better personal relationships with a small-time private landlord and have found dealing with problems with a big landlord totally impenetrable because of the layers of bureaucracy that's in their way to get to the heart of the matter. So I don't really know whether there's actually a reality in my experience being common as everybody else's, so I'm not sure. At the end of the day, though, the dynamic is still the same. The dynamic is still the same. These people are still economically inactive. We keep talking about people who have genuine disability, for example, as being economically inactive. That's the government's way of phrasing it, when these people have no other choice because of something outside of their own control. Yet landlords relish in what they call passive income, i.e. other people's work paying for their house, right? That is, unfortunately, whether it's a big landlord or a small landlord, it's still parasitism. It's still rentierism. It is still not work. It's still not a job. And whilst you say, well, people want to be able to have a retirement savings fund, well, maybe get a pension like the rest of us, rather than expecting poor people, i.e. people who can't afford their own house, not even their first house, to pay for your second house for you to be able to use for retirement savings. I'm sorry, I don't buy into that at all. And this is a big economic overall poor effect, right? If we have a huge glut of people, whether corporate or individual, who are making money off of owning stuff rather than working, they're not contributing to the productive capacity which all of our economy is based upon, right? Having people who are being productive and doing work is where all the wealth comes from in society, when this is basic understanding of where value is created in an economy. And people who just buy assets and use that to rinse money and scalp it away from people who actually do productive work in society, that's not good. That doesn't increase productive capacity and is overall parasitic. And that's why we should be having more social landlords, and then at least the what revenue does come in is then put back into society for the benefit of everybody, rather than being usually gone into further inflating property values higher by being spent on increasing the portfolio of these landlords, again, whether individual or corporate. And you've got to think, why are we in this situation? Why are we in this situation where so much of our economy, whether it's just being used as a portfolio, whether it's actually being used for rentals, is just property? Our property sector is gigantic in this country. It's all we do is property and the financial sector, right? I've said before, this entire economy is 3 financiers in a trench coat, and most property speculators are basically financiers in another name anyway. And this is because of the electoral pressures that came from Right to Buy. When a bunch of our housing was financialized and commercialized, treated like an asset rather than the use of social utility, its use value as a commodity, right? We took it away from its use value and only talked about its exchange value and what it could be worth to someone financially. That created, by selling off our council housing, a glut of homeowners. These became a very large electoral base over the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and up until today. It's why basically every single change of government has been because of a failure in housing. The Black Wednesday value, things that happened post 2008, and the crash in the mortgage rates under Liz Truss has been big moments that changed things electorally. And every single government has had to come in and put the needs of the home-owning democracy, quote unquote, much higher than renters or people who are too poor to be able to own. So renters got left by the wayside while governments continually used a base of people who owned property to be able to win elections. But since, of course, that same dynamic of over-financialization means people get outcompeted by the super rich, the wealthy, and corporations, this sector of society, as we see, that's also shrinking as well. The the kind of the Leviathan of private equity and corporate capital. It's eaten up all the working class for all of those years. And now it's suddenly coming after the middle class. That base is shrinking overall as millennials become a bigger part of the voting electorate and are able to shift things more towards the interests of renters. It's why even the Tories had to concede that maybe they need some rental reform so they don't become politically irrelevant. But unfortunately, these things are very difficult to be able to row back on. As you start nationalising property, which has to go on the market for you to be able to do, and you need a government that's amenable for doing that in the first place, this problem will only get worse. It will only see, as we've seen with basically every other pretty inelastic market, this level to which the financialized assets get subsumed by the interests and by the money of the super rich, by corporate capital eating these things up. Only a strong state, only a government that wants to make real change will actually revert this to the system that we had before by taking on the greed of corporate capital. Do I think the current government will do this? Absolutely not.
No, not in a million years. But can you just imagine how much more money there would be in the economy if we had like proper social housing, rents were lower, and so whatever rent you were paying, you knew was sort of going back into like replenishing that stock of housing or getting new social housing. But you just have more in your pocket at the end of the month that you'd be like, putting into the economy. It's so much has been extracted. It's not just from my pocket that money has been extracted by landlordism. It's from the economy as a whole, because they're on the whole just squirreling it away or buying further properties with it. I'm going to go to the Comstock. Had one good comment on the top story, which is really applicable here. Karen Carlin says, if you believe in the dignity of work, the moral thing to do would be to confiscate all wealth not accrued through work, send the rentier class to work in the fields. What a cheerful thought to end the show on. Thanks for joining me, Helena.
Absolutely. Good to end the show with a little bit of Maoism there. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Live.